Welcome to A Place for Film, the IU Cinema podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about Bond, James Bond. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Andy Hunsucker.
And I'm Jason Thompson.
And on this week's episode, we're going to talk about the entire James Bond series. We did like 20 minutes on Skyfall last week, Jason. There was a lot left unsaid just about the history of the franchise and all that stuff. So we're talking about that with Will Scheibel, a grad student in CMCL Communication and Culture here at Indiana University.
Hello.
Yes, thank you for coming, Will. And you've brought a stack of books with you.
I did.
So I'm guessing that you know a little bit about James Bond.
I've spent some time thinking about it.
Good. Actually, the reason I thought of you for this episode was I saw on your Facebook page you posted a picture of a 007 tie. Was that your tie?
That was my tie.
Okay.
Yeah, and I almost wore it, but then I thought, no,
that's just a step too far.
Yeah, I didn't want to cross the line.
All right, so let's talk about James Bond. So the latest James Bond film just came out, Skyfall. We talked about it. By the way, we might talk more about Skyfall. We might just say things about it. So if you haven't seen Skyfall yet, maybe wait to listen to this one because we're not going to sort of muzzle ourselves on Skyfall.
I thought we did a good job at keeping it spoiler-free last time around.
Yes. So James Bond. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about James Bond. Will, tell me all of the secrets about James Bond.
I don't know if I know any secrets about James Bond, but first of all, I'll say that I found the film Skyfall fascinating. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I saw it opening night, and I mean, I have a long kind of personal investment in the Bond series. Just as a kid, I grew up watching them, and then they're so rich for kind of academic film and cultural study that I wound up writing about it as a master's student and publishing an essay on Casino Royale. So it's something that is both a kind of fan favorite, and it's something that I have a kind of scholarly interest in. And so as a thriller, as an action thriller, I thought Skyfall was just completely compelling. I was totally engaged the whole time. I thought it was just a really polished, elegant film on a kind of generic level. That action sequence in the Shanghai building is maybe my favorite action sequence in a Bond film. It's very noirish.
Yeah.
And that said, just kind of intellectually, I think the movie is full of stuff to keep talking about, and I want to see it again in the theater before it leaves. I think one of the things the two things that I've been most fascinated about with Skyfall is, one, it's a film that's doing film criticism. At least that's how I've been talking about it with a couple of my friends that just saw it. We've been kind of having this back and forth conversation about how it seems like a film that's analyzing the James Bond films.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's doing what the James Bond films do and then kind of critically commenting on it at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's interesting, and we can talk about that if you guys want. The other thing I think is interesting is the way it kind of is a reboot within a reboot. Yep. And you guys talked about that last time, how you have Casino Royale, which is sort of the reboot for James Bond, and then Quantum of Solace, which is kind of this forgotten middle child of the James Bond trilogy, the new James Bond trilogy. And then, since a lot of people didn't seem to like that, you have this film, which almost kind of acts like that never happened and then reboots Bond.
Yeah.
And instead of trying to introduce Bond to a millennial audience or a new, younger generation, it plays it as a kind of nostalgic or maybe even reactionary character who's completely estranged from this time, this moment in time. So instead of the universe of Bond being an index of what's hip and what's cool, it's almost like the mantra in this film is it's hip to be square, because he's constantly out of step. Quite literally, he's falling down. He's injured. And Bond is always having things done to him, being tortured or whatever. But here, he is this broken man. And so it's kind of about how he's perpetually out of step with his own time rather than being the kind of hero of his own time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting too that when you said that, I kind of thought to myself, well, of course, the sort of whole point of Skyfall is the fact that he goes back to his own personal roots. So it is interesting that it's like going back to the James Bond roots as a franchise, but then also the character himself is also going back to his roots. So yeah, it's just like this loop over and over.
The villain is also going back to his roots.
You know what? Yeah,
Yeah, he was a
totally
former
right.
agent, and so he's going back to deal with his past as well. That's a really interesting read on it.
Like in the old days when they used to show movies like all day at the theater, and you could just walk in while a movie was already in progress, and then you would sort of stay until that moment where you say, well, this is where we came in. I kind of read Skyfall as this is where we came in with the James Bond film. So it ends kind of before Dr. No starts, even though it's not really taking place before 1962.
Yeah.
So,
well, let's talk about that aspect of it, because the James Bond series has sort of revels in, sort of reimagining. I don't know of any other franchise. The Bourne franchise is trying it now. That it's just like, you know what? We're going to keep making these movies, even if the actor doesn't want to do it anymore.
Right.
And they kind of did that out of necessity because Sean Connery just kind of didn't want to do it anymore. And they tried it with Lazenby, and I totally forgot. You're right. You mentioned this before we started, that they actually got Connery back after Lazenby sort of crashed and burned box officely. And then they just were like, they just went with a totally different actor. And that sort of became a tradition in the franchise. So is that just the nature of the franchise, that they're allowed to reboot that way?
yeah, and this is one of the things that I find so fascinating about Bond is it defies kind of temporal logic. He's sort of ageless. Well, Roger Moore, I guess that's debatable.
Yeah.
But, they don't make any attempt to kind of explain why, Pierce Brosnan looks younger than Roger Moore did at the end of, View to a Kill or something like that. But I think the Bond movies work like traditional genres. It's repetition, but with variation, a kind of variation on a theme. So people, when they go see a James Bond movie, and you said last time on the show that, you hoped that every other James Bond movie was not like this, So people want certain things when they go to a James Bond movie. They want to see the formula. There's something comforting about seeing this formula that's been repeated, sometimes ad nauseum. But people want to see change too. They want to be surprised. And I think the Bond movies that tend to do poorly with critics are the ones that don't have enough of that, or the changes are awkward, like the overly kind of campy humor in the Roger Moore films, let's say, or even Quantum of Solace, which some people thought was too serious, too somber with the strange editing choices and things like that. So it's the formula with a twist. And I think that's always been the logic of James Bond, is kind of replicating what people seem to like, but then also parodying the character maybe, or parodying his world. And you certainly get that with Roger Moore's films, Moonraker, Live and Let Die, Man with a Golden Gun, or critiquing it like Daniel Craig's movies.
Yeah. I feel like Goldfinger, I just rewatched this recently, kind of started that whole sort of almost parodying of the Bond series. That's where a lot of these elements kind of started. That's where you had Odd Job, the strange villain sidekick, and, the James, I mentioned this, I was just fascinated by this moment. James Bond defeats the villain in a moment with golf etiquette.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, right, well, you hit a different ball, so I guess I win.
Which is one of the most satisfying, moments in that film.
Yeah, but that definitely has sort of a silly aspect of it. Like, you expect James Bond to, like, karate chop someone or fire a gun. But, and I think, I would say sort of that idea of, like, giving us something new but keeping it as close to the original. I think Casino Royale is really a good version of that, where it's like they kept M, they dropped Q, they sort of, he still had the gadgets, but they weren't as big a deal.
It's not a gimmick as much.
Yeah.
Or he didn't use them.
Yeah.
Like he just was like, I don't need this to do this job.
Yeah. Or they were insanely practical. Like he got poisoned, so he had to have the heart defibrillator kit in his car.
Right.
Like, or the tracking bug. Very simple thing, but he has it.
Yeah. It's interesting. To go back just to something you said, I never sort of had thought about the James Bond sort of series as a genre. Like it's funny, like when did that happen? Like when did it become so formulaic?
Some video stores actually have the James Bond movies as their own genre.
That's okay.
I mean, there are very few video stores anymore. Back when people our age used to rent movies, growing up, sometimes you'd have, horror, action, adventure, and then James Bond, maybe a subcategory. James Bond.
Yeah,
film.
exactly.
I love the movie, but one of the things that seems to be most interesting to me, at least, in the way that the formula gets tweaked or parodied or satirized or whatever as the movies go along, is the way the politics are always being questioned, which I think is one of the most interesting things about this Daniel Craig cycle. That's one of the things that this may surprise people listening to the show, but James Bond is something that, as a franchise, that academics are obsessed with. There's been lots of scholarly material published on James Bond, and I think it's because there's so much politically that needs to be kind of dealt with there. And I know a lot of academics that enjoy the Bond movies, but are completely repulsed by the politics that some of them represent. And it's interesting how the films can be read as maybe deeply conservative or even fascist, but you could also read them as undermining their own conservative politics as much as they are replicating them, and that becomes very self-aware as you get to the Daniel Craig cycle. Just as a footnote, I wanted to mention that IU is kind of home to a lot of critical thinking about James Bond. I don't know how many people know that the Lilly Library houses Ian Fleming's papers. The Lilly Library houses the original manuscripts for almost all of the Bond novels except for Thunderball, The Man with the Golden Gun, and a short story collection called Octopussy and the Living Daylights. Fleming was also an avid book collector, and it houses the first editions of these books that he would collect, mostly about scientific discoveries, and also some of the kind of correspondences and interviews used for his biography. So there was an academic conference in 2003 kind of in conjunction with this material, and that conference led to the publication of an edited book, a collection of essays called Ian Fleming and James Bond, The Cultural Politics of 007.
Yeah, show it to the...
and it's by Edward Commentale, Stephen Watt, and Skip Willman. And both Ed and Steve are English professors here at IU, and Skip got his PhD here at IU.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff right here on campus that people can go to for thinking about this. But this collection is one of many things that really tries to unpack what's going on in the universe of Bond. And I think that there's probably something in this movie that warrants yet another collection to be dealing just with the stuff that's happening in these Daniel Craig movies, the way that they're dealing with Bond as a post-Cold War character. He's maybe the quintessential Cold War character. I mean, for those listeners that know the Bond series, Spectre, the kind of evil organization. It's funny because I was going back and watching some of the Sean Connery ones before Skyfall, and they really work. And this is coming from a place of sincere affection that I have for these movies. They really work as very funny comedies or self-parodies. And maybe it's just because I'm bringing Austin Powers in my mind to these films. But it's funny how Spectre in those films seems to have kind of red ties, like it seems to be sort of a communist enemy, but it also seems sort of like it's doing its own thing. It's very apolitical. It's just sort of all-purpose evil. And so that's a way that they kind of get out of some of those like historical material politics, and it just becomes like Dr. Evil, and certainly that the Craig film seemed to be explicitly calling attention to a post 9/11 moment, but it's also interesting how they're doing it there seems to be a self-aware attempt at political correctness, even if these films don't entirely work their way out of those problematic reactionary Bond politics. So, for example, the villain in Skyfall is fascinating. He's at once Norman Bates, Hannibal Lecter, the Joker. So it's not so much this kind of political or national villain as a monster. It's like an old-fashioned monster in a serial killer movie or a monster movie. But he's also the failed spy. He's Bond's kind of failed double. He's, in really kind of overly Freudian psychoanalytic terms, he's the Bond that was not able to repress the feminine, that was not able to disavow the feminine and kind of sever that connection to the mother, who's the Judi Dench character, M. And so by the end of the movie, it's about how Bond learns how to become a normative, quote-unquote, proper male who's subsumed under the law of the father, who is, spoiler alert, the new M. And that last line, with pleasure, while he's looking with this kind of crazy, he looks like Humphrey Bogart in a Lonely Place, is this Bond becoming a hero, or is this Bond becoming an anti-hero?
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned last time on the show, or maybe you did, Jason, when they're fighting in the building, you can't tell who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. I read that as a totally thematic moment where Bond is not that much different than these cold-hearted killers that he's chasing.
Yeah, Casino Royale hit on that a lot as well with sort of like the ending where it's like, Bond was fighting for Queen and Country, and now he's, he sort of wanted to walk away from that for this woman, and now it's like, now he just wants revenge. Now he just wants, now he just hates, and I thought that was a really interesting sort of commentary to make on the character. And Quantum of Solace, I thought, extended that a little bit.
Absolutely. And even for all the problems that I wasn't crazy about the movie, although I do want to go back and watch it again. I think maybe one of the things that people were uncomfortable with is Bond is more like Dirty Harry in that one, or Charles Bronson in Death Wish.
Well, especially towards the end. I mean, he leaves the guy out in the desert with like nothing but oil to drink. It's just that's like a slap in the face. And then they don't try to sort of make Bond seem like a good guy anytime after that. It's just
not
like
your father's Bond.
He just walks or drives away, and then you're just like, did that really? Is he not turning around now? Like, is he not playing a joke to get what he wants? No, he's just straight revenge. Like, you're gonna be out here, and I'm gonna kill you, and this is the worst way to die.
The other interesting thing about Quantum of Solace, as far as I can tell, it's the only direct sequel to a Bond film.
Right.
All of the others are sort of like nebulous, like they could have happened at any point in the timeline.
Time
here.
is totally fluid, where here there's explicit continuity. I mean, sometimes you'll have references to like Bond's wife and things like that.
And they're recurring characters occasionally.
But and I mean, people didn't seem to like that, though. I think people maybe like the self-contained quality of the Bond movies. How you
see, that was the main aspect that I liked about Quantum of Solace.
I actually
they were
did
trying to like connect it directly to another story. Let's see what happens after all this stuff happens. Like what happens to this person, this character after all that happens.
Well, and I think it's interesting because it limits Bond to a certain storyline, but at the same time, it's just like, how is he going to break away from this in this new environment? Like, it is really interesting. I never sort of thought about it in a direct sequel kind of way, but it does. I mean, obviously he's trying to do all these things, but at the same time, you can't just start introducing all this crazy stuff because it wouldn't make any sense. And that's one thing sort of in Skyfall where he it's totally, and even in Quantum of Solace where it's totally legitimate that he has to go sort of underground to just have his own personal time. Whereas in all the other Bond movies, it's just kind of like this convenient thing like, oh, well, then I'm just going to show up in a tropical shirt and you won't realize who I am. It's just like, no, like you have to run away from yourself in order to and that's what happens in Skyfall. That's just so fascinating that he runs away from himself. But of course, you've got the scene where he's got the woman in bed with him, and it's just like he's trying to run away from that, but it's just there in his face. And then, of course, that's also what pulls him back in.
When Bond's identity, as much as the time is fluid in the world of Bond, Bond's identity is also fluid too, and changes. In Roger Moore, he's this kind of aging gentleman spy who has this kind of wry grin on his face the whole time. In Sean Connery's Bond, he's more of a kind of film noir Bond. He's a detective almost, And towards the end with like You Only Live Twice, it's a little sillier. But, he is kind of a tough guy. He's a hard man, And then with Daniel Craig, it's maybe sort of Bond as vigilante. And I almost wonder if there's a way in which we can read all of these films as his attempt to stabilize a totally unstable identity that's always in flux. And the only way he can do that when all other forms of articulation fails by asserting his own name. Bond, James Bond, I am Bond. But it's also a totally arbitrary name too. It's kind of a meaningless signifier. So
okay, so we're getting a little close on time, but let's talk about favorite Bond movies and favorite actor to play James Bond. Barry Nelson notwithstanding. Start with Will.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Well, this is always changing. And I think Casino Royale and Skyfall, if I had to say, best Bond movie in terms of most well-made film, like most well-constructed film that I admire as a piece of filmmaking, I would have to say Casino Royale and Skyfall. In terms of my personal favorite Bond, film, it would be either Goldfinger or From Russia with Love. I used to, for a long time, say Goldfinger, but after revisiting From Russia with Love, that one is kind of neck and neck.
It's just an excellent film.
Yeah.
Like, I just watched it last week, and it's just a good movie.
It really
Forget about
is,
the
yeah.
Bond
Sure.
aspect of it. It's just a really solid film.
I think more so than maybe any of the other old Bond movies, for people that don't like James Bond or don't respond to the character of that world, From Russia with Love almost is like a Hitchcock film. It's like North by Northwest.
Yeah.
It's that good. It's that well done. And I like Connery a lot. And those are the films that I came to Bond as a kid with. And Goldfinger seems to have everything that you could ever really want from a Bond movie. It's serious and hard-boiled and action-packed, but it's also sexy and funny, and you have people
And
jumping out of
just
ejector seats.
that ridiculous.
Exactly.
Just ridiculous enough.
Without it crossing the line into Roger Moore in outer space or
Yeah.
jumping across alligator heads or
Sean Connery dressing up as an Asian gentleman.
in
You only live twice.
Oh, yeah.
Faking his death, and now he's Japanese.
Yeah, that was
Let's put some insulting makeup on him.
that was
something
a
you
pretty
could.
cringeworthy
Yeah,
moment.
you could only do
Absolutely.
that in the '60s. Only do that in the '60s. Jason,
So what are the questions?
favorite Bond film and favorite actor to play James Bond?
I can't get away from Daniel Craig as Bond. I just really am receptive to his performance. There's something about it that, especially in Casino Royale, it's
He's
just
great.
It's just like, especially when they get to the casino and he's got the girl, and that's what's really fascinating about that movie, because I actually rewatched it. That was another one I actually was able to see over Thanksgiving, was that how involved the girl character is, and then how sort of her emotions are really his emotions, but she's the only one to sort of reveal them. And and it's like, everything that should go sort of smoothly, like it always does in the films, like that staircase fight scene is just like brutal. It's just like, that's exactly how I feel like this should happen.
Yeah.
And he just brought this really refreshing, realistic, gritty sort of. I didn't like Brosnan as Bond.
I like him a lot.
I just find it, and I don't know if it's him or if it's the stories that he's put in. I think maybe I would be more receptive to him as Bond if the stories just didn't seem so awful, like at times. I like his the early stuff there, but favorite Bond movie. I kind of feel the same way about Casino Royale and Skyfall. I'm liking Skyfall way more now that we've been talking about it, but I really like Casino Royale. I want to say Moonraker because it's so campy.
Yeah.
It's just so out there. It's just so silly. Like, how does the society allow this to happen at any point, any alternative universe? Like, how does this go down? And it's just one of those where you can just kind of have to just let go. You just have to let go and just let it play out. It just I don't know. I'd have to say that one because it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like because obviously I'm like really receptive to the realistic portrayal of Bond with Daniel Craig, but for some reason it's just like when I think of Bond, almost in an Austin Powers kind of way, like you said, that's the movie I'm like, yeah, without a doubt. Maybe not my favorite, but just the one that I'm just like, okay, if you have to watch, if you've been watching these Daniel Craig movies, you should see where this came from.
Yeah.
Like, and somehow try to make that connection without watching everything in between.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm going to throw that one out.
All right. I can't disagree with Casino Royale. I think it is my personal favorite Bond film, again, just because Daniel Craig just brings something to it that I don't know if any other actor could have done. Like, it was interesting because they went from Roger Moore to Timothy Dalton, and Timothy Dalton just did not work at all. So they went to Pierce Brosnan, who I thought GoldenEye was an excellent film. I really, really liked GoldenEye.
I like it a lot.
And for a while, until Casino Royale, I would have said it was probably my favorite James Bond film. And I liked that one because it also sort of went into the backstory of who James Bond was.
Right.
It introduced another agent. It's sort of in a Skyfall way where it's like, now you have to fight your past. You did this thing in the past, and now it's coming back at you.
I just may have to revisit those movies. Maybe that's just what it is.
Well, okay. Revisit GoldenEye.
I will
Don't
revisit
go any.
GoldenEye.
Maybe Tomorrow Never Dies if you're feeling lucky. Don't watch The World Is Not Enough or Die Another Day,
No, Die Another Day
which
is
is the absolute
atrocious.
worst Bond film I'm convinced. I watched it recently. It's so awful.
I think that, the Pierce Brosnan movies, especially GoldenEye, is probably the first time we get an explicit shift into the Bond movies as trying to explore what it means, what James Bond even means.
Yeah.
There's that moment where M says, "You're a relic of the Cold War, a sexist, misogynist dinosaur." That would have never happened in the Sean Connery movie. So here, I think that's the transition point where Bond becomes completely self-aware of the politics and narrative.
But what I find interesting about Pierce Brosnan is he's almost like a throwback to like the Sean Connery era. He's like the dapper gentleman, and he's got the you can put a tuxedo on Pierce Brosnan at any point, and he looks good in it. It's like he's designed to wear a tuxedo. Daniel Craig is not. He's more muscular.
They make fun of that in Casino Royale. It's just that great scene where he's just like, "You got this tailored." Like it just like I can't like I would never have to do this.
Like Pierce Brosnan is more of like a dapper dandy. And Daniel Craig is more of like a down to earth sort of James Bond, and I love that about it. I gotta say, Daniel Craig is my favorite Bond at this point. I love everything he's doing with that character, but it wouldn't be as interesting if it hadn't had that whole history up to that point. As far as favorite films, Casino Royale is right up there. GoldenEye is right up there still. But I go back to the Connery. I go back to From Russia with Love and Goldfinger. I think Goldfinger is just that perfect encapsulation of like, if you want to know, like if you want to get all the references in Skyfall, just watch Goldfinger. You'll understand all those references, every single one, because it has the Aston Martin, it has Q, it has the wood paneled office for M. It has it has all this stuff. It has Moneypenny, and you get all of it in that one film.
And it's kind of a period piece. I mean, for as much as those old Connery movies have dated in certain ways, they kind of read as period pieces of the Cold War of the 60s in British cinema at the time.
Yeah.
And then one thing that I found really interesting was I went back and watched Dr. No, and how sort of I don't know why I always thought that movie was sort of like not darker in the sense of sort of its plot, but just sort of darker in its cinematography. It's like the opening scene is just like the most bright. I just seemed very like television-y when I saw it. I was just like, is this really what? And then that's kind of because I was like, well, if I'm going to start, I might as well start with the first one. And I didn't really go much further after that. Just things caught up with me. But yeah, I think it would be interesting maybe to try to break it down in terms of the actor. Like, what's your favorite from this actor? Because it is, I mean, because now you're like throwing out, From Russia with Love. And
well,
like,
I could definitely do that if you want to do that.
We could. I mean, we might need to.
All right, Sean Connery for me, probably Goldfinger, favorite from him. Roger Moore, I would say Man with the Golden Gun. I love Christopher Lee as the villain in that one. He's so good.
Yeah, I totally forgot he was in that.
View to a Kill is right up there because Christopher Walken is kind of amazing. Timothy Dalton, Living Daylights, I guess. Definitely not License to Kill. And then the last two, GoldenEye and Casino Royale, definitely.
I would say Goldfinger and From Russia with Love for Connery. I'm not crazy about Lazenby's, only made one movie. For Roger Moore, The Spy Who Loved Me, hands down. For Dalton, I didn't really like either of those movies. Like you said, I've pressed, I guess, Living Daylights. And then for Pierce Brosnan, I love GoldenEye. I know you said you didn't like it. I love Tomorrow Never Dies.
I thought it's the best other than GoldenEye. I mean, it's way better than The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day. I just didn't. It's a step down from GoldenEye, but it's still worth watching.
I like both of those a lot. And I even though those are the ones that were the new Bond movies when I was a teenager, I still enjoy them. And then with Daniel Craig, Casino Royale and Skyfall. I think I have two for everyone for most of the Bonds, but I find Skyfall as interesting and as compelling and watchable as Casino Royale.
I definitely want to see it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one thing, and I'll give you sort of the alternate one that I don't think has been mentioned, but I think the really interesting thing about Casino Royale and Skyfall is that Casino Royale kind of takes its time, whereas Skyfall seems to just kind of be like, let's go, but you're still getting so much as it's doing that. There's a little bit of a lingering period, obviously, when he sort of goes away into whatever tropical paradise he was at, but it's just like, that's like the pause button.
Yeah.
The only pause in the movie, and then everything else is so crazy.
It's very tightly constructed.
Whereas when you rewatch Casino Royale, you're like, wow, they're really taking their time. Like each game is played out on screen, and then there's a fight sequence, and then he comes back and they play yet another game. It's just like, but you are enjoying it the whole time. It's just like it's real leisure in its time, almost in the same sense as Quantum of Solace. I think that a lot of complaints that I heard was that it was too boring. Like there was just so much time, especially towards the end, where it just didn't seem like anything was happening. But realistic in that portrayal, because you have to get to point A to point B. It's going to take a while.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the only one that really wasn't mentioned, especially for Roger Moore, is I really like Live or Let Die. I just find it to be a really fun movie, almost in the same sense as Moonraker. It's just kind of like New Orleans as a setting for a Bond movie. Like that's a pretty unique setting in its own right. And then you're going to throw James Bond into it. And then, of course, jumping cars and, crocodiles and all that. It's just like, okay, like this seems very weird. If you're gonna put Roger Moore through the ringer, you might as well put him in New Orleans. Yeah. So that's really the only one I would agree for the most part with what you guys said. But for me, for Roger Moore, it has to be that one because it's just so ridiculous. Yeah. I guess that's what it is. It's like the older the movie, the more ridiculous it has to be for me to enjoy it. Yeah. I guess. I don't know. It just seems kind of weird, but From Russia with Love, I need to rewatch that one because I'm totally getting a good vibe on that right now.
Yeah. It does have the one really ridiculous scene with the foot dagger. Yeah. Do you remember that with the old lady kicking at James Bond with the foot dagger? I watched that with a friend, and we both just burst out laughing when that scene started. I was like, "Oh wow, this is so."
But it's become so like iconic. Like you can't imagine it without Rosa Klebb and her, sharp boot or whatever, knife in the boot, and
so funny. All right, we better get out of here. We could talk about this all day. I would love to talk about this more, honestly. But yeah, so let's get out of here. Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I
always interesting to have you on the show. So I'm Andy.
And I'm Jason.
This has been, and always will be, A Place for Film. A Place for Film is recorded at WFIU Studios in Bloomington, Indiana.